freeze came without warning, the kind of overnight cold that turned the palace greenhouses into casualties before anyone thought to check the thermostats. I heard about it the way I heard about most disasters in the old quarter, which was Nessa banging through the shop's back door at 6 in the morning, with her phone already pressed to her ear and her scarf still half wound around her throat. "They lost the hellebores," she said. "All of them. Every stem in the primary display, and they need replacements by 11. I was elbow-deep in a bucket of water, stripping thorns off a delivery of garden roses, and I did not immediately understand the scale of what she was telling me. Bell and Briar filled small, precise orders. We did christenings and retirement dinners, and the occasional museum exhibit that wanted botanically accurate Victorian arrangements. We did not do emergencies for people who owned television networks. "Whose display?" I asked, though some old, cautious part of me already suspected. Nessa lowered the phone from her ear and looked at me with the particular expression she wore when she was about to ruin my morning. "The wedding," she said. "The royal wedding. Today's royal wedding. They need white hellebores and flowering quince, and apparently we're one of 6 growers in the capital with a greenhouse cold-controlled enough to have kept ours alive through the freeze." I set down my shears. Cutting stems required attention, and my attention had just gone somewhere else entirely, to a version of myself 6 months younger, watching a woman in a plain dark coat examine a single white hellebore like it might tell her something true. "We don't do royal weddings," I said, which was not a refusal so much as a fact I was still hoping might hold. "We do today," Nessa said. "They're paying triple rate and covering transport, and if we say no, they'll go to Aubrey's, and Aubrey's will ruin the color balance and take the credit for our greenhouse stock for the next 10 years. She was already pulling crates toward the door. "I'll drive it over myself. You stay and mind the shop." That was the plan. I want to be clear about that, because everything that happened afterward has been reported as though I engineered my own arrival at the ceremonial hall, and I did not. Nessa was meant to make the delivery. I was meant to spend the morning trimming roses and pretending my chest did not tighten every time the radio mentioned the wedding, which it did roughly every 4 minutes, with the kind of breathless civic enthusiasm reserved for coronations and royal engagements. Then the van wouldn't start. It was an old van, older than either of us, and it had been making a doomed clicking sound for a week that we had both agreed to ignore because neither of us wanted to pay for a repair before the holidays. It chose that morning, of all mornings, to die completely, coughing once in the alley behind the shop, and then falling silent in a way that felt almost deliberate, though I have never believed in that sort of thing. "I'll call a cab," Nessa said, already sounding close to panic. "I'll load what I can into the back of one and pray." "You can't fit 40 stems of quince into a cab," I said, and heard myself continuing before I had fully decided to. "I'll take my grandmother's van. It's smaller, but if we pack tight." "You'll take it," Nessa repeated, staring at me. In 6 years of running the shop together, I had never once volunteered for palace work, had in fact developed a small, private reputation among the wedding planners of the capital for turning down anything with a royal seal on the invoice. Nessa knew why, in the vague way she knew most things about me, which was thoroughly and without details. She thought I had been badly hurt by someone rich once. She was not wrong. "Someone has to deliver it," I said. "I'll drop the crates at the service entrance and be back before you've finished repotting the ferns." I believed that when I said it. The drive to the palace took 40 minutes through streets already closing for the procession, and by the time I reached the loading entrance behind the ceremonial hall, my grandmother's van smelled like crushed rosemary blossom and the particular sweetness of quince about to open, and my hands were steady in the way they always were when I had work in front of me and no room to think about anything else. A coordinator in a headset met me at the door, took one look at my delivery manifest, and waved me through with the harried efficiency of someone who has already had 4 crises before 9 in the morning. I unloaded. I was meant to leave. That would have been the whole story, if the arrangement flanking the northern side of the altar had not collapsed 40 minutes before the ceremony, its wire frame giving out under the weight of too much quince, scattering white petals across the ancient stone floor in a pattern that looked, from a distance, almost like snow. "You," the coordinator said, finding me in the loading bay where I had lingered too long, admiring the architecture instead of leaving like a sensible person. "Are you a florist or a driver?" "Florist," I admitted, already knowing what came next. "Then you're the only florist currently on the premises, and the arrangement by the north transept is on the floor, and the doors open in half an hour." I want to explain, for anyone who has never worked with flowers under pressure, that there is a kind of tunnel vision that takes over in moments like that. You stop seeing the enormity of the room. You stop counting the cameras. You see the stems, the wire, the water levels, the angle of a broken branch, and your hands simply begin doing what they know how to do. I was rebuilding that arrangement, kneeling on stone that predated my country's constitution, before I had fully registered that I was doing it inside the actual ceremonial hall, with actual dignitaries filing in behind me in actual formal wear, murmuring about the delay. I finished with 12 minutes to spare. I gathered the broken wire and the extra stems into a canvas bag, and I turned to leave through the side aisle the way I had come, and that was when I made the mistake of looking up. The hall was full. Hundreds of guests in tiered seating, sunlight coming gold and cold through the high winter windows, an ocean of white flowers that I had helped provide arranged in careful drifts down every aisle, cameras on tripods at the back, broadcasting to screens across the entire country. And at the altar, in formal royal dress the color of old ivory, stood the Queen. I had seen her photograph everywhere for the 10 days since the engagement had been announced. I had trained myself, with the discipline of someone protecting an open wound, not to look at those photographs longer than necessary. But a photograph is not the same as a person turning, mid-vow, and finding your face in a crowd of strangers. Elara Valecourt looked at me the way a person looks at something they had convinced themselves did not exist. I have read, since then, dozens of accounts of what happened next, most of them wrong in interesting ways. They describe her as freezing. They describe a hush falling over the hall like something out of an opera. What actually happened was smaller and more human than that. She lost the thread of the sentence she had been speaking. The officiant, gently, asked her to repeat it. She did not. Beside her, Duchess Adrienne Sorel, dressed in silver-gray silk, followed the direction of Elara's gaze, with the composed alarm of a woman recalculating everything she thought she understood about her own wedding. I looked away, first. I had trained for 6 months without knowing I was training, for the possibility of seeing her again, and none of that training had prepared me for doing it in front of 400 witnesses and a national broadcast. I turned toward the side door with my canvas bag of broken wire clutched against my chest, and I walked, and I did not run, because running would have made it a scene, and I still believed, in that moment, that I could leave without becoming one. Behind me, I heard my name. Not a title, not an announcement to the room, just my name, spoken low enough that only the people closest to the altar should have heard it, except that every microphone in that hall was live, and it went out across the entire country in the same breath as the ceremony itself. Liora. I kept walking. I reached the door. Behind me, I heard fabric moving, a murmur rising through the guests like wind through a field, and Adrienne's voice, quiet, precise, carrying further than she probably intended. "Elara, what are you doing?" I did not look back to see the answer. I pushed through the door into the snowy service courtyard, and the cold hit me like something honest, and I stood there for exactly as long as it took to hear the door open again behind me. She had followed me outside without a coat. I turned, and there she was, standing in ceremonial white in a stone courtyard in the middle of winter, snow catching in dark hair that had been pinned with a precision no wind would normally dare to disturb. She looked, for the first time since I had known her in any form, completely unguarded, and I hated how much that still mattered to me. "Go back inside," I said. "I can't." "You managed to leave me once," I said, and I heard the old anger in my own voice, sharper than I had let it be in months. "I'm sure you can survive walking 20 feet in the other direction." "Liora, don't." My breath came out white in the cold air between us. "You do not get to say my name in front of the entire country, and then explain yourself to me in an alley, like I'm a scandal you need managed. That is not what this is." "Then what is it?" I said, and I meant it as a real question, though my voice made it sound like an accusation. which perhaps it also was. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer at all, which would have been the old pattern, the one I already knew too well. Then she said, "I was standing at that altar telling myself I had made peace with duty, and then I saw you walking away, and I understood, all at once, that going through with this marriage would not be sacrifice. It would be cowardice. I have called it duty for months because duty sounded better than admitting I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" I said. "Afraid of me?" "Afraid of what I would do if I let myself want you honestly," she said. "So I chose not to want anything honestly. I am telling you that badly. I have had a great deal of practice saying things carefully, and none at all saying them truthfully. I wanted, in that moment, to feel something simple, vindication maybe, or the fierce relief that romance stories promise you when the person who hurt you finally says the right words in the snow. What I felt instead was fury, clean and total, because she was still doing the thing she had always done, which was making a decision that reshaped my life without once asking what I wanted done with it. "I am not going to be your excuse," I told her. "I will not stand in this courtyard while you turn me into the reason you get to walk away from a wedding you agreed to. If you don't want this marriage, that has nothing to do with me. Go back inside and tell her. Tell all of them. I will not hide out here while you make me into gossip." She looked at me for a long moment, snow settling on her shoulders, and something in her face changed. Not softened exactly, but resolved, the way a decision finally sets after being argued with itself for a long time. She turned around. She walked back inside. I stood alone in the courtyard, certain I had just watched her choose the marriage after all. Certain that my anger had done nothing but hand her the permission she needed to go through with the life she had already decided on. I remember thinking, with a bitterness that felt almost restful after months of confused longing, that at least now I understood completely. At least now there was nothing left to wonder about. Then my phone began buzzing in my coat pocket, and around me, in the hands of the palace staff still moving through the service courtyard, I heard other phones doing the same thing, a chorus of small vibrations that meant something was happening that everyone needed to see. The broadcast had resumed. I found a service door with a window into the hall, and I watched, my breath fogging the glass, as Elara Valecourt stood before the altar beside a woman in silver silk and announced, in a voice that did not shake once, that the marriage would not take place. She did not name me. I want that understood clearly, because it mattered enormously in the days that followed. She said that Duchess Sorel deserved a marriage built on complete truth, and that Avaloon deserved a sovereign, willing to take responsibility for her own choices, rather than hiding them behind the convenient architecture of duty. Then she turned to Adrian directly, and though I could not hear what passed between them, I watched Adrian remove her ceremonial gloves, finger by finger, with the deliberate calm of a woman closing a door she had been holding open far too long, and say something too quiet for the cameras, that I would only learn the words to much later. "Finally," she said, "I did not stay to see what happened next. I have never enjoyed being an audience to my own life, and the hall behind me was already dissolving into the particular chaos that happens when several hundred important people realize, simultaneously, that the story they came to watch has become an entirely different story. I left through the loading entrance, climbed into my grandmother's borrowed van, and drove back to Bellenbriar with my hands too tight on the wheel and my mind entirely too loud. Before I go further, I want to pause here because it's important, and because my Patreon audience in particular deserves to hear this directly from me before we return to the story. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. By the time I reached the old quarter, there were already 3 vans with satellite dishes parked outside the flower shop, and a young man with a camera trying to peer through the front window past the display of winter jasmine Nessa had arranged that morning, with no idea what the day would bring. I parked 2 streets over and walked the rest of the way, head down, coat collar up, and let myself in through the courtyard door before anyone thought to look for me on foot. Nessa was waiting inside, pale, holding her phone in both hands like it might explode. "Please tell me," she said, "that you are not the Omega from the wedding footage." I did not answer her directly. I did not have to. My silence was answer enough, and I watched something complicated move across her face. Hurt that I had never told her about Ella, worry about what came next, and underneath both of those, the fierce protectiveness that had defined our whole working relationship since we were teenagers stripping thorns together in our grandmother's greenhouse. "Her name isn't Ella," Nessa said slowly. "Is it?" "Her name is Elara," I said, and sat down hard on an overturned crate, and for the first time since the freeze had started this entire disaster, I let myself cry. The days that followed reshaped my life in ways I had spent 6 months trying to prevent. My face, once identified by a persistent photographer who matched my shop's delivery van to the palace's loading manifest, was suddenly everywhere. Newspapers I had never read ran headlines calling me the Flower Omega, the Alley Bride, the woman who stole a queen from the altar, though I had stolen nothing, and had, in fact, told the woman in question to go back inside, not 20 minutes before she abandoned her own wedding entirely on her own authority. Strangers left flowers on our doorstep with cruel notes attached, congratulating me on my conquest, or warning me of my ruin, sometimes both in the same message. A camera lens appeared outside my bedroom window on the second night, aimed at the gap in my curtains, and I did not sleep properly again for a week. Nessa handled the chaos better than I did, in her way, which mostly involved threats and, on one memorable afternoon, a bucket of flower water thrown with impressive accuracy at a photographer who had climbed onto our neighbor's wall for a better angle. Mrs. Okafor, who had bought her anniversary roses from us every year for 2 decades, could not get past the crowd on the pavement one morning and had to be walked in through the alley by Nessa, muttering the entire time about the indignity of it, though she still bought her roses. What surprised me, in those first raw days, was what Elara did not do. She did not send guards to stand outside the shop. She did not have me move to the palace for my own protection, a phrase I had already learned to distrust from an old relationship that had used almost exactly those words to explain why I should stop seeing my own friends. She did not buy Bell and Briar, or quietly settle the debts Nessa and I had been carrying since a bad winter 3 years earlier, though I later learned she had been shown, more than once, exactly how easy either would have been. She issued one public statement instructing the royal household not to contact me without my express permission, and then, apparently, she meant it. Instead, a woman named Captain Sarah Dane came to the shop on the 3rd day, alone, without uniform, and asked to speak with Nessa rather than me, which I appreciated more than I expected to. She laid out several security options, ranging from a monitored perimeter to nothing at all beyond what we already had, and made it clear, in a voice that struck me as genuinely careful, rather than merely diplomatic, that the choice belonged entirely to us. I chose the least invasive option available, a discreet patrol past the shop twice a night, nothing more. It felt, at the time, like the only decision anyone had let me make since the wedding, and I clung to it accordingly. In those early days, I also learned things about myself I had not expected to learn. I discovered that grief and anger could occupy the same body without canceling each other out, that I could miss a woman I was furious with in the very same hour, sometimes in the very same breath. I discovered that Nessa, for all her bluster, kept a folder of the worst articles written about me, hidden in a drawer, not to torment herself, but so she would know exactly what lies she needed to be ready to argue against if a customer repeated them at the counter. I discovered that my grandmother's old customers, the ones who had known me since I was a child, stripping thorns behind the register, did not care in the slightest what the newspapers said, and made a quiet, deliberate point of coming in more often that month rather than less, as though loyalty could be measured in bundles of carnations. I also learned, more slowly, what it meant to be watched by people who had already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. A journalist cornered me outside the bakery 2 streets over and asked, with a friendliness that felt like a trap, whether I had always dreamed of marrying into royalty. I told her I had never once dreamed of it. Not before, not during, not after, and that the question itself revealed more about her imagination than mine. She printed the quote anyway, stripped of its context, under a headline that made me sound coy. I stopped reading the papers after that, mostly, though Nessa still read them for me, and delivered only the parts she judged I could survive hearing. I should explain, since it has been reported so many wrong ways since, how Elara and I came to know each other in the first place, because the anonymous version of her was not a performance built for seduction. However, it has since been characterized in certain corners of the press. It began the way most important things in my life begin, with a flower. She came into Bell and Briar on an ordinary Thursday evening in early autumn, in a plain, dark coat with no jewelry and no visible security, and asked for something for someone she had lost. I assumed, reasonably, that she meant a funeral arrangement, and began pulling toward the lilies before she stopped me and said, with an odd formality that I would later understand was simply how she spoke when she had not decided how much of herself to allow into a room, that she wanted something smaller. A single flower, something honest. I gave her a white hellebore, because it was December blooming and stubborn and looked, that year, like the only thing in the shop willing to survive the season. She turned it over in her gloved hands and asked what it meant, and I told her, half out of habit and half because I liked watching people's faces, when they learned that flowers carried whole vocabularies most people had forgotten how to read. Hellebore, I told her. Serenity. The strength to endure a difficult season and come out the other side of it intact. She said flowers were, by nature, temporary, and that meanings attached to temporary things seemed to her impractical. I told her that temporary things could still matter, that a season survived was not a lesser thing simply because it ended. She left without buying anything else, and I assumed I had lost a strange, well-dressed customer to my own opinions. She returned the following Thursday and bought rosemary blossom, and the week after that, winter jasmine, and the week after that, a small branch of flowering quince. Always one flower, never a bouquet, always with the same explanation. For someone I lost. It took me 3 months to learn it was her mother she meant, and I learned it only because I finally asked, directly, on an evening when a citywide power outage had trapped us both inside the greenhouse behind the shop, working by lantern light while the storm outside made the glass roof sing. She told me that night about a memorial garden she visited every Thursday, and about a mother who had died suddenly, leaving her a country before she had finished grieving the woman who raised her. I did not know then that the garden belonged to a queen. I knew only that the woman across from me, whom I had been calling Ella for 3 months, because that was the only name she had given me, had a grief in her, that she carried the way I imagine most people carry, something they are ashamed of needing. I could describe the entire 6 months that followed in exhaustive detail, and some evenings, in the aftermath of the wedding, I did exactly that in my own head, turning the memories over like objects I was trying to authenticate. I remembered catching her outside the shop one morning, eating one of Nessa's cheap cinnamon pastries with an expression of such profound, uncomplicated pleasure that I laughed out loud, and she looked up at me with something close to panic, as though I had caught her at treason rather than breakfast. I remembered her insisting she did not need help carrying water buckets, and then, 20 minutes later, silently carrying 4 of them anyway, because she had noticed my arms shaking and refused to say so directly. I remembered teaching her to strip thorns from a rose stem without tearing the bark, and how she listened with the fierce concentration of someone used to mastering things quickly, and how she cut her thumb anyway, and stared at the small bead of blood on her glove like it was an unfamiliar diplomatic incident rather than an ordinary accident. I remembered our first real conversation, hours long, by lantern light, when the power outage stripped away whatever careful formality she usually kept between herself and the world, and she told me, in fragments, about a childhood spent being taught that a monarch does not belong to herself, and I told her, in fragments of my own, about an alpha woman I had loved once who had used protectiveness as a slow, patient leash, until I left before it tightened all the way. I remembered how quiet she went after that, and how, afterward, she never touched me again without asking first, in a way that felt less like caution and more like respect finally practiced out loud. I remembered our first kiss, which I started, on a night after closing, when I had taught her to build a bouquet that looked deliberately imperfect, all crooked stems and unmatched textures, because perfection in flowers often meant something had been forced into a shape it did not naturally hold. I remembered a second kiss, weeks later, that she pulled away from, breathless, saying her feelings were becoming more serious than she knew how to carry safely, though she did not explain, then, what she thought the danger was. I remembered a morning we nearly slept together, and instead spent talking in my bed until the light came up gray through the curtains, trading small truths back and forth like currency neither of us had spent freely before. And I remembered, with a clarity that still hurt months later, the way all of it simply stopped. 5 months in, she disappeared without a word. I sent messages to the number she had given me. None were answered. 10 days after her silence began, Avaloon announced the engagement of Queen Elara Valecourt to Duchess Adrienne Sorel, and I watched the Queen's photograph fill every screen in the shop window at the appliance store 2 doors down, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a floor giving way beneath you, that Ella had never existed at all. She sent one letter after that, handwritten, delivered by a courier who would not meet my eyes. I returned it unopened. I did not for a long time regret that. There were other memories, smaller ones, that I did not share with anyone, not even Nessa, because they felt too much like mine alone to hand over for public inspection. The way Ella had once fallen asleep sitting upright in the shop's one good armchair while I finished closing accounts at the counter, and how I had stood over her for a full minute before waking her, simply looking, trying to memorize a face I did not yet know I would lose. The way she had asked, once, with genuine confusion, why I bothered keeping flowers that had already begun to wilt, instead of throwing them out the moment they lost their perfection, and how offended she had looked when I explained that a flower past its prime still had things left to teach a person who was paying attention. The way she had learned over months to sit on the greenhouse floor instead of the single clean stool, because it put her at the same height as me when I knelt to check the soil, and how she had never once mentioned doing it on purpose, though I noticed anyway. I remembered, too, the specific quality of her silences, which I had once mistaken for coldness, and later understood as concentration. She listened the way most people only pretend to, retaining details I mentioned once, in passing, months earlier. She remembered that I took my coffee with too much milk, and not enough patience for the machine to finish heating it properly. She remembered which flowers I refused to sell out of season, even at a premium, because forcing them early felt to me like a small, specific cruelty. She read every handwritten card I ever attached to a bouquet before it left the shop, even the ones addressed to strangers, as though the words themselves mattered to her, independent of who they were for. All of that history sat between us, in the days after the wedding, like a third presence neither of us had invited, but both of us had to account for. I refused, at first, to see her. She requested a meeting through Captain Sarah, and I said no, twice, and gave what information I had instead directly to Sarah, because it mattered more than my own comfort. I had noticed something wrong in the wedding photographs, while scrolling through the coverage against my own better judgment, a habit I could not quite break even while hating every article it produced. The arrangements I had delivered were correct, down to the last stem. But the bouquet Elara had carried to the altar, before Adrienne took it briefly and passed it to an attendant, contained 3 stems of a flower I had not supplied. Silver starwort, pale and unassuming, easy to miss among the white hellebores, unless you had spent your whole professional life memorizing what belonged in a display and what did not. I knew what silver starwort was for, because my grandmother had taught me the old, mostly forgotten protocols surrounding it. Alpha monarchs had once carried it during succession ceremonies, its pollen known to intensify pheromone response during moments of heightened emotion. Modern protocol had banned it decades earlier. Once the risks became clear, the possibility of destabilizing an alpha's instincts during exactly the kind of intense, public, emotionally loaded ceremony a wedding provided. The amount woven into that bouquet would not have harmed anyone. It would only have made Elara's alpha instincts more visible, more intense, more likely to produce the kind of unmistakable, cameras rolling display of dominance that would have made canceling the marriage afterward politically unthinkable. She had never touched the bouquet directly. It was Adrian who carried it those first crucial minutes, close enough to the altar for the ceremony's traditional scent vow. I told Sarah everything I had noticed. I did not, at that point, agree to see Elara. Several days passed before I changed my mind, and I changed it on my own terms, in my own shop, after closing, with Sarah waiting outside and no cameras anywhere. Elara arrived without ceremonial dress, in the same kind of plain dark coat she had worn during our anonymous months, and stood among my buckets and half-trimmed stems looking, for the first time in the entire ordeal, genuinely out of place. "Why did you disappear?" I asked her, before she had finished taking off her coat, because I had rehearsed the question too many times to let her open with anything softer. She gave me, first, the answer she had clearly practiced. Something about protecting me from surveillance, about political timing, about the constitutional pressure surrounding the Sorel marriage reaching a crisis point that could not accommodate a scandal. "You're giving me a press statement," I said. "I don't want a press statement. I want the truth, even if it makes you look small." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, the polish was gone from her voice. "Melis discovered I had been visiting you," she said. She had photographs. She told me a public romance would be portrayed as the crown exploiting an Omega woman through an impossible power imbalance, and she was not entirely wrong to worry about that, even if her reasons for worrying were not the ones she claimed. At the same time, the negotiations around the Sorel marriage were collapsing, and she told me that if I withdrew from the engagement, an entire reform package would fail with it. I believed I had exactly two choices: marry Adrian and stabilize the country, or pursue you and risk destroying your life, along with whatever remained of my credibility. "You chose duty," I said, flat. "I told myself I chose duty," she said. "The truth is smaller and worse than that. I chose for you." I decided, without asking, that disappearing was a mercy, that you would be safer not knowing, and I told myself that was noble, because admitting I was afraid would have required more honesty than I had available to me at the time. "Afraid of melees?" I asked. "No," she said. "Afraid you would ask me to stay, and afraid, more than that I would say yes." I did not forgive her that night. I want that understood plainly, because so much of what has been written about us since treats that conversation as the moment we reconciled, and it was not. I told her that I had loved Ella completely, and without reservation, and that I did not yet know whether I could love Queen Elara Valecourt, because Ella had let me believe we stood on equal ground, while hiding the largest imbalance either of us could have named. She did not argue with that. She said only that she understood the criticism was fair, and that she would not ask me to set it aside simply because acknowledging it was painful for her to hear. Before she left, her eyes caught on an old book I kept on the counter. Its spine cracked from use, and she went still in a different way than before, because she had recognized what was pressed inside it. I closed the book before she could say anything. She said nothing anyway. I have never been entirely sure what that silence cost her. What followed over the weeks after that conversation was not a swift reconciliation, but something slower and, I think now, more honest, built almost entirely outside the palace's walls rather than inside them. She had to earn her way back into my ordinary life in ordinary increments, because I would not accept anything grander. She came before sunrise one morning to help unload flower crates, after two of our regular delivery staff refused to cross the press line that had, by then, mostly thinned but not entirely vanished. I told her, half serious, that queens were not typically covered under our employee insurance policy, and she answered, completely without irony, that she had already checked, and I realized, with the particular exasperation reserved for people you cannot help loving, that she genuinely had. We went to the public flower market together on a gray Sunday morning, she in minimal disguise, Sarah trailing at a distance that managed to be both discreet and entirely unconvincing to anyone who looked twice. I taught her to judge a plant by its roots rather than its blossoms, told her that anyone could grow something that looked healthy for a photograph, but that only strong roots kept a thing alive past the season it was bought for. She bought us both cinnamon pastries from the same stall Nessa had always favored, and pretended, badly, not to understand why I was smiling at her over the paper bag. She came back to fix the latch on the greenhouse door one evening and did it badly, and I redid it properly while she watched with the expression of a woman who had never once in her life been permitted to fail visibly at anything small, and who did not seem entirely sure what to do with the experience. We sat together in the shop office late one night and read parts of the letter I had once returned unopened, and it contained no grand secret, no magical excuse, only the plain, painful record of a woman trying and failing to tell me she loved me, while still not giving me any real choice in the matter. We visited Queen Ysara's memorial garden together, and standing among the same flowers she had bought from me one stem at a time for months, I finally understood, completely, that every purchase had been grief translated into something she could carry in her hands. I attended one formal dinner at the palace, reluctantly, because I had information about the silver starwort that needed to reach the right people directly, and I found myself overwhelmed within minutes by staff anticipating my every movement before I had finished forming the thought myself, refilling water I had not asked for, adjusting my chair before I had decided to sit. Elara noticed and quietly dismissed most of the room without turning it into a spectacle, and afterward, when we were alone, I told her not to rearrange the world every time I looked uncomfortable. "What should I do instead?" she asked, and I could tell the question cost her something, because it was not the kind of question she had been raised to ask anyone. "Ask," I told her. She did, after that. Constantly, carefully, sometimes almost formally, in a way that should have felt strange and instead felt like the most honest thing anyone had offered me in years. There was an evening, too, when Elara invited me to see the royal greenhouse, closed to the public for decades, tucked behind a wing of the palace most tourists never even knew existed. It had fallen into a kind of dignified neglect, its old iron frame still sound, but its beds overgrown and untended, and she walked me through it apologizing for its condition, as though its failures were a personal one. I told her the disorder was the best thing about it, that a garden left entirely to its own devices often revealed what actually wanted to grow there, rather than what someone had once decided should. She stood very still after I said that, in the particular way she stood when a sentence landed somewhere deeper than I had intended, and then she asked whether I would help her decide what to do with the space, and I understood the question was not really about horticulture at all. We spent an entire Sunday afternoon there together, clearing dead growth, and she recited back to me, unprompted, facts about soil composition and root dormancy that I had only ever mentioned once, months earlier, to a woman who had told me her name was Ella, and nothing else. I asked her how she remembered all of it. She said, without any particular drama, that she had never stopped thinking about any of the things I had taught her, even during the months she spent trying to convince herself she had let all of it go along with me. There was an afternoon, weeks into our slow rebuilding, when my omega instincts reacted strongly to her during an argument that had nothing to do with either of us. A shipment gone wrong, a client who had insulted Nessa over the phone, ordinary frustrations that left me raw enough that my body responded to Elara's nearness, the way it sometimes still did, without my permission. She stepped back immediately, put actual distance between us, and did not once treat my reaction as evidence that I wanted something I had not asked for. I noticed that restraint more than I had ever noticed any display of dominance from anyone. It felt, in a way I had not expected, like the most romantic thing she had ever done. Not everything in that stretch of months moved smoothly, and I do not want to pretend it did. As our relationship became more publicly acknowledged, something shifted in the way the country talked about me that I found increasingly difficult to breathe around. Royal merchandise appeared bearing flower imagery I recognized as my own shop's signature arrangements, reproduced without my permission. Commentators speculated openly about whether I would become royal consort, weighing the political implications of an omega florist entering the line of ceremonial succession, as though my life were a policy question awaiting resolution. Palace staff began, without being asked, extending me privileges I had never requested, holding doors, clearing paths, treating me with a deference that felt less like courtesy and more like preparation for a role I had not agreed to accept. The moment it became unbearable came on an ordinary Tuesday, when Nessa handed me a letter from a palace office I did not recognize, informing me, in dense administrative language, that I had been classified as a protected intimate of the sovereign. The classification, it explained, limited certain kinds of travel, subjected me to periodic security review, and granted palace protection staff standing access to portions of my schedule, all framed as a straightforward safety measure, requiring no action on my part because it had already taken effect automatically the moment our relationship became publicly acknowledged. I confronted Elara that same evening, the letter still crumpled in my coat pocket. She explained, at first, that the classification existed for my safety, that the palace's protective systems activated certain protocols automatically once a relationship reached a particular threshold of public visibility, and that she had not personally requested it. It was, I told her, precisely the wrong thing to say. "This is exactly what I told you I was afraid of," I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking with something closer to panic than anger. "I kissed you. I did not surrender my keys. I did not agree to have my schedule handed to strangers because some office decided my life needed managing on my behalf." She understood then how serious it was, and she ordered the classification suspended within the hour, personally, without delegating the decision to anyone else. But fixing it did not resolve the deeper fear underneath it, which was that simply loving her might reshape my life in ways neither of us fully controlled, regardless of either of our intentions. I told her I needed space, real space, not a symbolic gesture but actual distance in which to remember what my own life felt like, without a title attached to it. She gave it to me completely, no guards trailing secretly behind me, no gifts arriving unannounced at the shop, no manufactured emergencies designed to put us back in the same room before I was ready. No messages relayed through staff pretending to be routine business. For several weeks, we did not see each other at all, and the separation hurt in a way I had not expected. A dull, constant ache that made even ordinary tasks feel heavier than they should have. During those weeks, Elara returned to her full public duties under what I later learned was considerable pressure from what remained of Mayalis's allies, and I watched her on television from my apartment window some nights, unable entirely to look away. She seemed colder in those broadcasts than she had in months, more like the winter queen the newspapers had always described and less like the woman who ate cinnamon pastries on my back steps, and I found myself wondering, in my worst moments, whether Ella had ever been real at all, or whether she had simply been a version of Elara that could not survive contact with the actual weight of the crown. Bell and Briar suffered during that stretch as well. Several of our larger clients quietly withdrew their business, unwilling to have their weddings and galas associated with a scandal still working its way through public opinion, and for the first time in years, I found myself genuinely worried about whether the shop would survive the season. I refused, flatly, when Elara's office offered financial assistance through an intermediary, and to her credit, she respected the refusal completely and did not attempt to circumvent it. When a journalist later published a false claim that Bell and Briar had received secret royal financing, the palace released our actual, unglamorous financial records within a day, correcting the record without once suggesting the correction had been done as a favor to me personally, or that I owed anyone gratitude for simply being told the truth about my own business. Adrian visited me once during that separation, without announcement, and bought an armful of ordinary garden flowers she clearly did not need. She sat with me in the back of the shop, while Nessa pointedly found reasons to be elsewhere, and told me, in her characteristically direct way, that loving Elara would never be an ordinary thing, that the weight of who she was would always be present in some form, no matter how much either of us wished otherwise. But she also told me that ordinary was not the same thing as free, that she herself had lived an entirely ordinary, entirely constrained life for years inside her engagement, and that the absence of scandal had not meant the presence of choice. What mattered, she said, was deciding for myself which costs I was willing to accept, rather than either accepting all of them blindly or refusing all of them out of fear. Nobody else, she reminded me, pointedly, could make that decision on my behalf, including Elara. I thought about that conversation more than any other during those weeks apart. The pressure on Elara, meanwhile, was mounting from an entirely different direction. What remained of the Constitutional Council, still shaken by the unfinished wedding and Melis's disgrace, began demanding that she either announce a new, politically acceptable marriage plan or accept a formal limitation of crown authority imposed upon her rather than chosen. Melis's allies within that council fully expected her to eventually surrender to the pressure, to choose, again, duty over honesty, the way she always had before. Instead, she chose neither path they had offered her. She invoked the independent crown provision entirely on her own initiative before the council could force her hand, in the announcement I later watched from my apartment, the one that finally showed me she had learned something real. The first kiss after the separation came inside the old royal orangery during a thunderstorm, not long after her announcement, when she asked to see me again and I finally agreed. I had spent the weeks apart turning Adrian's advice over and over, trying to work out which costs I was willing to accept and which I was not, and I came to the orangery still uncertain, still raw, but no longer running from the question the way I once might have. I remember standing in the orangery, with rain hammering the glass overhead, overwhelmed by the unnecessary weight of everything we had both carried. The entire year compressed suddenly into a single evening. The wedding and the disappearance and the letter I never opened, and the months of learning each other twice over. And Elara did not immediately speak about politics or Melis or any of it. She asked whether I was all right. I told her I did not know. She reached toward me, and then stopped herself, the way she always did now, waiting for permission she had once assumed she did not need to request. I closed the distance instead. I kissed her first, the way I had the first time, months earlier, in a different life neither of us had known we were living. She responded for several long seconds before pulling back just enough to ask if I was certain. "You used to make decisions for both of us," I told her, frustration and want tangled together in my voice. "Don't start making this one for me too." I kissed her again, and this time she did not pull away, and the rain kept coming down outside the glass, and for a little while neither of us spoke about anything at all beyond the immediate, overwhelming fact of each other. The political consequences of everything we had uncovered arrived faster than either of us expected. Melis did not fall apart quietly. She released selected photographs from our anonymous months, images of Elara entering the shop at night, of the two of us in the greenhouse, expecting the public to read them as evidence of a queen abusing her position with an unsuspecting Omega citizen. There was truth tangled into that accusation, and I was furious that private moments had been taken from us and turned into ammunition, but I refused to lie about any of it, simply to protect Elara from discomfort. I testified, eventually, before a constitutional inquiry held in the old circular parliamentary chamber, packed with elected representatives, judges, royal observers, and a press gallery that watched me with an intensity I had spent months trying to avoid. I told them the truth, all of it. I told them Elara had hidden her identity from me, and that the hiding had harmed me, and that when the truth finally came out through no honesty of her own, she chose disappearance and silence rather than telling me herself. I did not soften any of that for the cameras. But I also told them what she had not done. She had never used alpha pressure on me, not once, in 6 months of an intimacy that would have made it easy. She had never bought my affection, never threatened my business, never used royal authority to make me stay, or to make me forgive her. When I had finally asked her, weeks earlier, for space, she had given it completely, without a single guard following secretly, without gifts, without manufactured emergencies, designed to bring us back into contact before I was ready. Adrian testified after me, cool and precise, laying out exactly how Melis had manipulated the marriage negotiations from the beginning, how she had suppressed the independent crown provision because it would have permanently reduced the crown's inherited authority. The palace's own archivist, a quiet Omega woman named Thea Mar, who had known Elara's mother, produced the buried constitutional records herself. Captain Sarah presented the evidence of the silver starwort substitution, methodical and damning. Melis did not collapse into confession, She defended herself with the same rational conviction she had clearly used to justify every decision she had ever made in Elara's name, arguing that monarchies survived precisely because someone was willing to make the hard choices individuals were too weak or too selfish to make themselves. Elara answered her directly, in front of the entire chamber. If the crown can only survive by controlling the people trapped inside it, she said, then perhaps it deserves to become smaller. Maelys was removed from her position as keeper of the crown that same week, and faced formal investigation for the surveillance, the constitutional suppression, and the tampering with the wedding ceremony itself. She was not imprisoned. She lost her office, her influence, and much of her public standing, and I think, in the end, that was a harder loss for a woman who had never wanted personal power, only permanent control over an institution she believed she alone could be trusted to protect. I want to be clear that none of this reconciled Elara and me. We were, after the inquiry, still as separated as we had been before it, because surrendering political power was not the same thing as earning back what she had broken between us, and Elara understood that better than anyone might have expected. She did not come to me immediately after Maelys's removal, certain that doing the right thing publicly had earned her anything privately. Instead, in the weeks that followed, she invoked the independent crown provision publicly herself, without being forced to, surrendering centuries of inherited emergency power, transferring a significant portion of crown property into public trust, accepting democratic oversight that would outlast her entire reign. She did this without once suggesting it was for me. She said, in the announcement that every screen in the country carried, that she would not marry anyone to preserve powers that should never have depended on a sovereign's marital status in the first place, and she protected my privacy completely, never once naming me publicly in connection with any of it. I watched that announcement from my apartment above the shop, and understood, finally, that she had learned the thing I had needed her to learn. A choice only meant something if the person making it accepted the consequences herself, rather than asking someone else to carry them. Several days after that, she came to the shop after closing and waited outside until I unlocked the door myself. She carried no expensive gift. She held a single white hellebore, the same flower she had bought from me on our very first evening together, and she asked whether I remembered what I had once told her it meant. Surviving winter, I said. I don't know if we can go back to what we were, she admitted. I'm not certain that's even what I want. I don't want to go back, I told her. That relationship was built on a lie, even a well-intentioned one. I want something new. Or I want nothing at all. She agreed, without argument, and we had, that night, the most important conversation either of us had ever had. I laid out exactly what I would need if we tried again. My shop remained mine, fully, with no royal involvement in its finances or its future. My apartment remained mine, unless I chose otherwise. I would not become a decorative consort trailing behind her at state functions. No security classification would ever again be applied to me without my written agreement. No staff member would receive my schedule automatically. Nothing about our relationship would be announced publicly without both of us agreeing to it first. She did not get to decide, on my behalf, what risks I was allowed to take in loving her. She listened to every condition without once interrupting, and then she added one of her own. She asked that I tell her when something was wrong, directly, instead of disappearing to spare her the discomfort of hearing it, the way I had once nearly done to protect myself from precisely the kind of pain she had caused me. I recognized the irony of that request immediately, and so did she, and for the first time in weeks, we both laughed. Am I speaking to the Queen right now? I asked her, half serious. Or to Ella? Ella was never false, she said. She was simply the part of me that had never been allowed outside before I met you. I want the whole woman, I told her, not just the easy part. The kiss that followed was slow at first, and then it wasn't, and it happened among buckets of unfinished flowers in the ordinary shop, where everything between us had actually begun, and it felt, in a way the orangery kiss had not quite managed, like something we had both chosen with our eyes fully open. What came after was not a swift slide into palace life, and I am grateful for that, because I do not think either of us would have survived it if it had been. Elara began spending occasional nights in my apartment, and her security detail developed a genuine, well-documented hatred of my narrow, uneven staircase, which I found endlessly funny. She discovered that sharing a single small bathroom with another person was, in her own carefully worded assessment, more logistically demanding than negotiating an international trade agreement. I occasionally stayed at the palace, but I refused the traditional consort's wing entirely, because its doors connected directly to her private rooms and gave staff far too much easy access to a life I still intended to keep partly my own. She had the locks on my chosen rooms changed so that access ran only through me, and it took me a week to notice what that small architectural choice actually meant. There were mornings I will keep for the rest of my life. Elara arriving after a 12-hour constitutional session, exhausted in a way she rarely allowed anyone to witness, and falling asleep with her head in my lap while I pulled the pins from her hair one by one. An evening when she asked, formally, almost shyly, whether she might scent my scarf, and I said yes, and wore it the next day simply because I wanted to. A chaotic dawn at the flower market, where she proved catastrophically bad at bargaining, and a small child handed her a crushed daisy, which she accepted with the gravity of a state gift, while I hid behind a stall trying not to laugh loudly enough to draw attention. A morning she attempted to cook breakfast and produced something more architecturally precise than actually edible. A warm bath we shared after a freezing outdoor ceremony neither of us had wanted to attend, quiet and slow, and far more about comfort than anything else. There was a night, months into all of it, when my heat approached and I made my own plan for how I wanted to spend it, and told her exactly what that plan involved, and she followed it without once trying to reshape it into something more convenient for herself. I felt, that night, the discipline she had spent her entire adult life building around her own instincts, and I understood, more clearly than any speech could have taught me, why the newspapers had once called her cold. What they had actually been describing, without knowing it, was restraint. One quiet afternoon, months after the inquiry, a palace tailor asked what should be done with the unused wedding attire from the ceremony that never finished, and Elara intended simply to have it archived and forgotten. I found it myself, hanging alone in a conservation room, pale and untouched, and felt not jealousy but something closer to grief, for all three of us, for every version of ourselves that had nearly been trapped inside that particular arrangement of silk and expectation. "Does it hurt to see it?" Elara asked, watching my face carefully. "No," I told her. "What hurts is knowing you thought you had to wear it." Adrienne, when she heard about the dress, chose to donate part of her own ceremonial wardrobe to a museum exhibition documenting the constitutional reforms that followed the wedding, giving herself, finally, some ownership over a memory that had never really belonged to her in the first place. She and I had become, by then, something unexpected and genuine. Not close friends exactly, but two women who understood something about each other that almost no one else could. Nearly a year after the wedding that never finished, Elara and I returned together to Queen Ysara's memorial garden on the anniversary of the first Thursday she had ever walked into my shop. The garden was just beginning to wake from winter, small green shoots pushing up through soil that had held nothing but frost for months. She brought no ring at first. She gave me a key instead, to a small, unused greenhouse on Crown land near the shop, and explained, carefully, that the government intended to convert the property into a public botanical education space, and had asked, through entirely ordinary legal channels, whether Bell and Breyer might want to run the program under a standard paid contract. The papers were waiting at my lawyer's office. I could refuse them completely, and nothing would change between us. That, more than anything else she could have said, told me how far she had traveled from the woman who once decided my future without asking. Then she took out the ring. It was elegant, simply set, nothing that belonged in a museum, and she asked me to marry her, not to be her queen, not to accept a title, but to be her wife. I made her wait several long, deliberate seconds, mostly because I wanted to watch her hold her breath for once instead of me. Then I said yes. Our wedding, when it came, bore almost no resemblance to the one that had ended in a snowy courtyard. We chose a smaller ceremony in the restored winter garden, rather than the ceremonial hall, with a guest list I actually recognized. Adrian attended, entirely willingly, and stood near the front with an expression I had learned to read as genuine warmth rather than obligation. Nessa cried more than anyone else in attendance, loudly and without embarrassment. Captain Sarah insisted she had not cried at all, which everyone present understood to be a lie of the kindest sort. Because of the constitutional reforms Elara had fought for, marrying her did not automatically make me a governing queen, and I chose, in the end, a limited ceremonial title I could set down whenever I wanted, keeping the name Belle professionally, and continuing to run Bell and Briar exactly as I always had. The flowers were mine, deliberately imperfect, designed by my own hands rather than a palace florist's careful symmetry, white hellebores and flowering quince, and rosemary blossom and winter jasmine, alongside ordinary market flowers that meant nothing to anyone outside the two of us, and everything to us. Before the ceremony began, I saw Elara standing alone, near the garden's open doors, and for one unsteady moment, the image echoed the first wedding so exactly that my chest tightened. But everything about it was different now. She was not standing there because the crown had placed her there. I was not delivering flowers through a service entrance, preparing to leave before anyone noticed me. Adrian was not waiting beside her to marry someone who did not love her. Nobody in that garden was trapped inside a life someone else had chosen for them. Elara saw me. This time, she did not leave the altar and come chasing after me through the cold. She waited. I understood, watching her stand there, perfectly still, perfectly willing to let me choose whether to close the distance between us. Exactly what that stillness cost a woman who had spent her entire life either controlling every outcome or being controlled by someone else's version of duty. It cost her the certainty she had built her whole identity on. It cost her the old instinct to fix, to decide, to protect, by removing all other options. She let it cost her that, standing quietly in the cold morning light, and she let the choice be entirely mine. So I walked toward her. Behind me, I could feel the winter garden's doors standing open, cold air moving gently through drifts of white flowers, carrying the faint mineral scent of frost, and the sweeter, warmer scent of everything beginning to bloom again beneath it. Neither of us needed to run through those doors this time. Neither of us needed an exit at all. I reached her and she reached for my hands, carefully, the way she always did now, waiting the half second it took for me to close that last distance myself. I did. I laced my fingers through hers in front of everyone who mattered to either of us, and somewhere behind me, I heard Nessa's loud, unembarrassed crying rise above the quiet garden, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, entirely and simply happy. The doors stayed open the whole ceremony. Nobody closed them. Nobody needed to. I had spent so much of the last year afraid of becoming someone's beautiful, kept thing, preserved instead of loved, arranged instead of chosen. Standing there with Elara's hands in mine, watching the winter garden come slowly back to life around us, I understood, finally and completely, the difference my grandmother had once tried to teach me. A flower cut and pressed will keep its shape forever, beautiful and untouched and entirely finished. A flower left rooted, watered, chosen again every single season, keeps growing instead, imperfect and alive and never quite finished at all. I had chosen the second kind. So at last had she.